So good morning and welcome to the final day of the 2023 Aspen Ideas Festival. We have saved the best sessions for last, kind of building up to a great crescendo. And we have a fascinating topic today. My name is Jim Picca. I'm the president of the Middle East Investment Initiative, which we founded here at the Aspen Institute to provide real economic development and job creation in the Palestinian territories and elsewhere in the Middle East and North Africa. I also serve as the Institute's general counsel. And I will introduce our panel. We'll have a brief discussion, and then we'd love to get some questions from the audience as well, and so we'll have some microphones go around. So to my far left is Martin Indyk, who is the Lowy Distinguished Fellow in U.S. Middle East Diplomacy at the Council on Foreign Relations. Previously, he was President Obama's Special Envoy for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations at the U.S. State Department and President Clinton's Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Affairs. He was twice appointed U.S. Ambassador to Israel and is currently chair of the Middle East Investment Initiative. So no nepotism or anything here. And to my immediate left is Shibli Tahani, who is the Anwar Sadat Professor of Peace and Development at the University of Maryland, where he directs the Critical Issues Poll. He is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. He is the author and editor of numerous books, most recently, The One-State Reality, What is Israel-Palestine? So, as you saw in the blurb for this discussion, we're talking about the two-state solution, which, since the Oslo Accords were signed between Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization in 1993 and 1995, really has been the bedrock of our vision for what a final agreement could be between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And so, Martin, maybe I'll turn to you first to give us a little bit of a tutorial or background on how we got to where we are today.
Thank you, Jim, and it's great to be back at the Aspen Institute Ideas Festival. Apropos of Jim's question, the last time I was here was in 2014, after I just concluded my time as Special Envoy for the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations under President Obama, which ended just before the Ideas Festival in another failure to try to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and establish an independent Palestinian state. And so it tells you something. In 2014 to 2023, there was no reason to bring me back to talk about the two-state solution, except now when we're talking about the death of the two-state solution, and we're actually talking about burying the two-state solution. But Jim's asked me to give you a potted history, and that's not simple, but I will try to do it very quickly and try to highlight a few things that I think are important as we have this conversation today. And I want to say one other thing, that Shibli and I are not going to agree today. It would be boring if we did. But Shibli and I are long-time close friends, so and I have the deepest respect for him. So friends may disagree, but we'll always remain friends. So the two-state solution actually originates in November 1947, when the UN General Assembly passed Resolution 181, which provided for two states in Palestine, a Jewish state and an Arab state. And that UN General Assembly Resolution 181 was the basis for Israel's declaration of independence. And the Jewish state was then established. The Arabs, as you probably know, rejected that partition plan into two states. And then the War of Independence and what the Palestinians call the Nakba, the disaster of that war and the refugee crisis that it generated, set in train the Israeli-Arab and Israeli-Palestinian conflict that raged. Fast forward to 1967, when the conflict broke out in another war, the Six-Day War. And as a result of that war, and Israel's victory in the war, it took control and occupied the West Bank and Gaza, so the Golan Heights and all of Sinai. But for our discussion today, it took control of the areas where the Palestinians were living other than inside Israel before 1967. And that occupation, which has been referred to as a cursed blessing, created the situation we find ourselves in today. At the end of that war, in 1967, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 242. And I bring that up because it's important in our discussion, because it provided for the unacceptability of the acquisition of territory by force, a very good principle now with applicability to the Ukraine war, but also provided for, and I won't go into the exact language, provided essentially for Israel to retain the territories it had occupied until it withdrew to secure and recognize borders in exchange for peace. So that the UN Security Council provided for a mechanism that enabled Israel to continue its occupation until such time as there was negotiations that would lead to peace and Israel's withdrawal from the territory it occupied. Back to the 1967 lines, if you follow the strict interpretation of that resolution. But the resolution also provided for withdrawal from territories. It didn't say all of the territories. And that's been part of the legalistic argument since. So fast forward again to the period, there was a period in which Henry Kissinger came in and negotiated the basis for an American-led peace process, which was essentially between Israel and the Arab states. Egypt was taken out of the conflict as a result of that process, made peace with Israel, and Syria was taken out of the conflict through a Golan disengagement agreement, which to this day, almost 50 years later, governs the relationship on the Golan Heights between Israel and Syria. The Palestinians were essentially ignored in this American-led process until the Intifada that took place in the early 1990s, the Palestinian uprising, and then came the Madrid process when all of the Arab states after the first Gulf War were sitting down in negotiations with Israel, and the Palestinians were at the table with Israel for the first time. That led to the Oslo Accords. That handshake on the White House lawn in September of 1993 between Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin, which seemed to open a whole new era of peaceful relations between Israel and the Palestinians. At least that was the promise. It's important to remember, as we discussed today, that the Oslo process did not provide for a Palestinian state. It provided for an incremental process of Israeli withdrawal in 3 phases from the territory it had occupied in 1967, from the West Bank and Gaza, but left open what the final status agreement would be. There was nothing in Oslo about Jerusalem, nothing in Oslo about borders, nothing in Oslo about refugees, and nothing in Oslo about a Palestinian state. Yitzhak Rabin, whom I worked with during those years, was clear that his vision was that the Palestinians would have their independence linked to a Jordanian state, with the exact definition of what the Palestinian entity would be left open. He called it an entity rather than a state. Then came Netanyahu, who was to me like the Antichrist sent by the devil to do in Oslo. That was my experience with him when I was there. And the whole process stalled. Then came Ehud Barak, and he came to Clinton and said, let's finish this conflict. Let's forget about the incremental process and the 3 stages of withdrawal, which Israel had completed 2 of them, and the Palestinians were in control of 40% of the West Bank as a result of the Oslo process. Let's forget about that. Let's go to Camp David and let's finish it. Let's have an end of conflict agreement, an end of claims agreement, and we will resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in one swoop. Very ambitious, a big mistake as it turns out, because it failed at Camp David. But people forget that after Camp David, at the end of that year, in December of 2000, President Clinton presented the Clinton parameters that came out of the negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians after the failure at Camp David. And that provided for the 2-state solution, which we're talking about today. That's when it was first introduced and became US policy, that a Palestinian state would be established with East Jerusalem as its capital, on more or less 95% of the West Bank, with swaps of territory to make up for the other 5%. And that proposal was one which, regardless of everything that's been said since, Ehud Barak, as Prime Minister of Israel, accepted, and Yasser Arafat did not. He basically didn't answer. Then we, again, we'll fast forward because this is taking too long. I'm sorry for this, but
it's a simple issue.
As a result of various presidents since Clinton trying to resurrect a final status agreement of 2 states for 2 peoples, each effort failed. As I said, I was the envoy involved in the last effort in 2014 with the Kerry principles to refine the Clinton parameters for the independent Palestinian state. Donald Trump, with his deal of the century, also tried to promote a 2-state solution, less generous to the Palestinians. That too failed, partly because they didn't even consult the Palestinians on it, but also because it was rejected by Netanyahu's right-wing partners, and so that went nowhere. And Biden comes in very much aware, as Vice President, of this sorry history of this effort to revive the 2-state solution, and basically recognized a reality that with Netanyahu as Prime Minister and Abu Mazen as the President of the Palestinian Authority, it was just not going to be possible to negotiate a 2-state solution. But it remained US policy to support a 2-state solution as the only way to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So here we are. We haven't had negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians about it since 2014. We haven't had any effort to resume the negotiations since the Trump administration. And it really raises a very big question mark about, is the 2-state solution a viable solution given this history?
So given that expert history, you and your colleagues in your book and in a recent article in Foreign Affairs magazine have argued that despite the laudable goals of a 2-state solution, we are in fact living in a 1-state reality. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for hosting me. It's always a pleasure to be with my friend Martin Indyk. And Martin and I, and not only are friends, but really both of us have been working for a 2-state solution all these years. And in fact, not just figuratively, we were once actually both together as outside advisors to the Obama administration working on this issue. So I come at it, and so my co-authors in the article in Foreign Affairs, the 3 others, 2 of whom have had very strong relations with Israel over the years, and very strong identity related to Israel. They're all, 2-staters. And frankly, if somebody were to put a 2-state solution before us today, miraculously, we'll say, grab it, because that obviously is probably the most realistic or the most sort of just solution under the circumstances that meets both national aspirations of Israelis and Palestinians. The problem is, it's not there. And we can't pretend like it's about around the corner, because since 2000, every single year, that objective has become more and more and more remote, to the extent that most people think it's not going to happen, including most Israelis and most Palestinians, and certainly most scholars in my field who don't think it's any longer realistic. Now, we can say, that we now have an Israel with an occupation in the West Bank and Gaza. That's a description that is technically correct. But occupation in international law has been always meant to be temporary. And yes, 242 leaves a lot of flexibility, but it said actually literally immediate withdrawal. And it was reinforced after the 73 war. There's another resolution 338 that would reinforce immediate withdrawal. But of course, it's been 56 years. And 56 years is a lifetime for most people. And we have no path to it tomorrow. We don't know when, if it ever it's going to happen. I still don't deny the theoretical possibility that it could happen. But it isn't something you can plan on. There is no path to it. There hasn't been a path to it. I was at an event recently at I'm not going to mention the name of the organization, but I believe Martin was there as well. And it was with a former Israeli leader whose name I can't mention because it was not for attribution. And the moderator of the event said, it's a one-state reality already, everybody recognizing that. And this person said, hold off, don't say that, because there's no alternative to the two-state solution. It might take another 50 years, but ultimately it'll happen. Well, okay, now even if you believe that it ultimately will happen, to think that there is going to be another 50 years, and already there have been 56 years, that's a lifetime. I'm sorry, that's not temporary. That's not occupation. That's a one-state reality that we are living in. And I asked myself, like many of my colleagues, I asked myself, we are looking at a territory between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean where basically half the population is Palestinian and half the population is Jewish. And some of the Palestinians are Israeli citizens, 20%, but there are 5 million who are in the West Bank and Gaza. And they have never known freedom in their lives. The overwhelming majority, most people in those territories have born in a state of humiliation and military control. They're not independent. They are in an environment of military rule with some autonomy, but we see what can happen when the ultimate authority is the military authority. And I ask myself often, if I had a child living there who knew nothing all their lives but humiliation and subjugation, and they're looking at a future where more is the same and even worse now with the rise of the far-right Israeli government, would I be proud of them if they did nothing to resist their humiliation? Peacefully, yes, of course, I would want that to be peaceful, not violent. But I see that the world is not enabling even a peaceful way to resist. How do we resist settlements if we then, as the United States of America, go into the United Nations, and when the UN is going to act over the expansion of Jewish settlements that are probably the biggest reason why we say two states may be out of the question now, and we try to shield the settlements from action at the UN, we, the United States of America. So we have become, as a country, inadvertently, I wouldn't say for bad intentions, we've been part of the same mechanism of American foreign policy over the years, trying to develop, inadvertently, we have become enablers of the entrenchment of this one-state reality that is unjust, profoundly unjust and unacceptable. Now, looking at it from the prism of Israeli Jewish population, obviously, if we see the threats to even democracy within the 1967 Israel. We see that now, and it's heartening to see all these protests against the judicial revolution that is being proposed that would even limit Jewish freedom and democracy within the state. It's very heartening to see, and those of you who may have watched the panel on this democracy yesterday, it was an excellent panel, but it didn't get into either the 20% of citizens who are Arab in Israel itself or the Palestinian environment. So looking at it from a perspective of a pre-1967 Israel with a temporary occupation that maybe will come to an end with a two-state solution, you can see it differently that way, because you could see, well, Israel is a democracy, a flawed democracy for sure, maybe even more flawed since the 2018 nation-state law, and there's structural discrimination against non-Jews within Israel itself, but it's not any worse than many other states around the world. And so, one can say, well, yeah, it's imperfect, but it's okay, and then there's the temporary occupation. But if you put in a new pair of glasses, and you say, come on, don't kid yourself, this is already a one-state reality. It is controlled by one state, and that is the state of Israel. And it is controlling by subcontracting and other means Palestinian areas. And Palestinian Authority has become more or less a subcontractor for Israeli security, not much more. It has no independence, dependent on the US, it's dependent on Israel. It is not capable of acting in a way that transcends the structural reality. If you look at it through that prism as a single state, and you look at the relationship between the government and the Palestinians in the occupied territories in a context of a single state, then you see something far worse than an imperfect democracy. If you evaluate Israel as being in control of the Palestinian lives in the West Bank and Gaza, the 5 million Palestinians, it looks a lot more like apartheid. And if that is the case, then we are facing a reality that is deeply unjust and must be addressed. And it goes way beyond the judicial proposals by the Netanyahu government, because all these things that have happened over the years, even before the rise of the far-right government in Israel. And therefore, we have to ask the question, what should be done? Now, I do not have a solution. I don't think one is possible right now. I think Martin is right, and I think even Biden administration is right. There is nothing in terms of a final outcome. I don't think there is a solution right now. I don't think the two-state solution is possible right now. I don't think a one-state solution with equality is possible. Recognizing a one-state reality is not a happy thing. It is a deeply unjust reality. It is one that is not likely to work. It is one that's likely to have a lot of pain. It's one likely to be strategically problematic. But recognizing it at least enables us to think about it a little bit differently. And also to recognize our role as the United States of America as being an enabler of this deeply unjust reality. And we have to have a different language, a different discourse. I don't think the choice right now is between two states and one state. Between two states and one state with equality. I don't think one state with equality is on the table right now, just like two states are not on the table. The reality now is the choice between one apartheid-like state and some other political outcome that's more equitable. That's the choice. And that's what we have to try to find. I don't think the United States of America can impose a solution at any foreseeable future. I think ultimately that solution is going to be by the Israelis and Palestinians. They're going to have to find a way to live together in dignity and equality. But we are going to have to be frank and honest about what exists now and about what we are doing that is enabling it instead of helping it forward. So that is really where we come from, both in terms of the book that we have co-edited, and also the Foreign Affairs article that we wrote.
So, Martin, given that description of the status quo, is the two-state solution still relevant in this conversation?
So let me answer first by responding to some of the things that Shibli said. There's a lot in Shibli's description which I agree with. But I think one has to be very careful, and I note that Shibli has been more careful in his explanation today of where he's coming from than would appear in the article that he and his colleagues wrote in Foreign Affairs. Because there you lean far more towards the idea of equality in a one-state solution than you have today. And I think your adjustment of that is important because it's easy in your making of this argument to suggest that what you really want to do away with, and many of your critics have made this argument, is the Jewish nature of the State of Israel, that you want a binational state for all its peoples rather than a Jewish state. And I think that direction is very problematic and in the end very destructive of relations between Israel and Palestinians, not least of which Palestinian citizens of Israel. There are two issues here which Shibli raises. One is that the argument that this looks like apartheid. And Shibli is careful not to say this is apartheid. He says it looks like apartheid. And I think there's good reason for that. It's because it looks like apartheid in the West Bank, where there are in fact, and it's developing even more under this government in Israel with its far-right members, two systems of government, one for Jewish settlers and one for the Palestinians there. But Israel itself, inside its original borders, is not an apartheid state. And the 21% of Arabs who are inside Israel, actually it's 17% who are Arab citizens, have equal rights. There is discrimination. Historically, there's been discrimination against them. It continues, but things are on the up and up in that regard. There's a greater recognition of the need to respect the commitment in Israel as a democracy to equal rights within the country. And Shibli makes this point that there is a varied way in which the one-state reality impacts Palestinians who are citizens of Israel versus Palestinians who are in the occupied territories. But I think that distinction is important. Israel is not an apartheid state when it comes to the way it deals with its own Arab citizens. The second point is what the US's role should be in this. And Shibli's argument is basically that we are the enablers and we have the responsibility to do something about this. My first point is that we have been trying very hard to do something about this for a long time. Successive presidents have tried to resolve this conflict. You can criticize those of us who've been involved, and it's fair to criticize us for failing. We failed, but it wasn't for want of trying. And as I said, even Donald Trump tried in his crazy way. So I think it's important to recognize that we have tried to address it. But because in trying we failed over and over again, there is an understandable reluctance to try it one more time because we don't have the actors to deal with in this regard. The Israeli far-right government under Bibi Netanyahu is opposed to a two-state solution, is opposed to an independent Palestinian state. And there's no way that that government could go forward, no matter how much pressure we put under it, to negotiate it on that basis. It would come apart, it would fall apart. So Netanyahu is not going to go down that road. And Abu Mazen, Jim reminded us this morning, he's in his 19th year of his 4-year term, lacks legitimacy, feels the lack of legitimacy amongst his people. He's polling in the single digits in terms of approval rating amongst Palestinians. And beyond that, reluctance on his part to take the kind of risks that would be involved. There is this belief on the part of the two leaders and on the part of their people that the other side is not a partner to this deal. That as much as both sides might want a two-state solution as the ultimate agreement, neither side believes that the other side wants it. The trust has been so destroyed in the process of trying to achieve a two-state solution that it doesn't exist anymore. So essentially, you can't get there from here. So to say that the United States should just weigh in again and try one more time, and this time with some magic wand we'll change these circumstances, is an unrealistic position. But I do think that if we have to weigh up between Shibley's solution, which is that the United States should start to pressure Israel to cut off aid to Israel, to change Israel's behavior, versus my preference, which is to start the difficult process of resurrecting a belief in a two-state solution and rebuilding the trust and not giving up on it, but rather trying to find a way to put the basic foundations back together again for a two-state solution. I'm happy to go into it if we have the time. I think it is much more productive to try to do that than to try to beat up on Israel and punish it.
Shibley, do you want to respond?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, on the my own remarks were actually in harmony with the article very much, because I think there were a lot of people who chose or misinterpreted us or chose to do so. We made it very clear in the article, said specifically, the U.S. shouldn't even try to have a final settlement solution, and that one state with equality is not on the table. And our recommendations were not really about diplomacy that could generate a one-state outcome with equality. We did say we should push for equality now, and let me explain why that is the case. And interestingly, Martin, I don't know if you remember, but 6 years ago, it was the 50th anniversary of the '67 war. We had a panel at the Council on Foreign Relations. Richard Haas moderated, if I recall correctly. And I had made an argument. I just looked up the notes, by the way, to just go back to see what we had talked about at that time. And I had said at the time, 50 years is a lifetime. We can't just pretend this is temporary anymore and just wait for a two-state solution. We should push for equality now. And you said equality now. What do you mean equality now? I said we should push for equality now. That should be the principle behind which we stand. It's not a political outcome. It is a principle. And why do I say that? We've been doing polling in the U.S. for years. So if you ask Americans, if you had to choose between Israel as a Jewish state, but without full equality for its non-Jewish citizens, or Israel as a democratic state with full equality for everybody, but it's no longer Jewish, 2/3 of Americans choose the latter, including 60% of Republicans. So the principle of, so people can say most Americans are anti-Israel or against Jewish state. No. You have to find an outcome, a political outcome, that with some equality. There are only two principal outcomes that can accommodate equality: two states, two independent states that, obviously within their own within their own states have equality, or one state with equality. If I am going to be given the choice between a Jewish apartheid-like state and a one state with equality, or two states, I'll take any of the two options at the end under all circumstances. I'm not alone. I think most Americans would. That is something that we need to make clear. So having a Jewish state is something everybody understands. Having national aspirations, everybody understands. But the idea that that could be enshrined in something that is similar to apartheid becomes wholly problematic and has to be addressed. And so when we're calling for equality, we are calling for standing for that. We're not naive. We don't think Biden's going to do that. We don't think Biden's going to push for a revolution in foreign policy with Israel. We think that if you state these things upright and push them as principle, you can help start changing the discourse. Because I do not think that policy as usual has worked. I think you're underestimating the extent to which we have been enablers of this one reality. I already mentioned the settlements. If the settlements, and they have very little to do with the Palestinians, because the settlements have been built from the beginning and have expanded under every administration, left and right in Israel, and every American administration, no matter what the administration did. That had been roughly an independent enterprise. And if you look at that, you have 750,000 Israelis beyond the green line already. That is the one reason why people say it's no longer possible. And yet, there are no consequences. So we are not only that we're not doing anything when we say we oppose the settlements, we're actually protecting the enterprise by working overtime diplomatically to lobby states in the UN to say, don't pass a resolution that condemns settlements. And then more settlements can be built. We have negotiated agreements with the Arab states. In principle, that's a good thing. We're broadening the peace, but without linkage to the Palestinian issue, so that Ben-Gvir can say, look, I can make peace with the UAE and Saudi Arabia and so forth without having to do anything on occupation. Why would they learn a different lesson from that? So we need to send a different signal. It isn't that that signal is going to be transformative. We're not optimistic about an outcome anytime soon. But we need to change the conversation. We need to stop hiding behind a two-state solution as an aim, which has inadvertently provided a smokescreen for a reality that is wholly unacceptable. If you are an Israeli, it still, in the short term, seems acceptable because Israel is still a flawed democracy fighting to maintain itself. And as Martin said, within the 67 Israel, certainly Israel is not an apartheid state. And what we call the system, even in the context of one-state reality, we call it a tiered system, where some non-Jews have most of the rights that Jews have. And then on the other end, most of the non-Jews don't have any rights. And so that's the context in which it is structured. So, but if you're looking at it only through the prism of the half of the population who are Jewish, it seemed painful but tolerable. If you look at it through the half who are non-Jews, it's intolerable, it's inhumane, it's unjust. And we can't just ignore that by saying, well, let's focus on this end where things look not bad. They could be better, but so that's, I think, we need to change that conversation. We need to think differently. We need to think in terms of principles, not in terms of political outcome for now. Let the Israelis and Palestinians battle it out, but they should know what we stand for in principle. and then they can fight it out for what political outcome would accommodate some form of justice and equality for both of them.
So I'd like to open up to questions. We've got a lot. And as expected, we've got some mics in the back. So I'm going to start some in the front, and then I'm going to go and I'm trying to distribute it around the room. So why don't we start right up here in the front? We've got a mic coming for you. Please add a question mark after what you say, and let's keep it brief so we can get a lot in.
I'll try and keep it real brief. But I had a friend and wanted me to ask Martin a question in particular. It's relative to what you've been saying about one state with equality. And then I have a question for both of you. He says, I had lunch with the French ambassador to Israel when I was in Tel Aviv, and he told me he was teaching a class of young adult Palestinians who told him they don't care about having a Palestinian state. They just want what Israelis have and would be happy with a one-state solution. And then he says, Yehud Yari, the leading Israeli analyst, told me recently that Palestinian elites have been running away from the two-state solution for over 10 years and prefer one state. So I'm wondering your response to that. And then the China session brought up a point that I'd like to ask both of you, which was the generational side to arguments and thoughts in difficult situations. I'm wondering if young Palestinians, young Israelis, young thinkers have different narratives on the solutions than.
So there are according to polling of Palestinians, there are about 20% of Palestinians who think this idea of equal rights in one state is a good idea. In other words, it is not exactly a mainstream position amongst Palestinians. Young people who've grown up and know nothing but Israeli occupation and know the Israelis and see how Israeli Arabs are living, say, we want the rights that they have. And that's completely understandable. I personally think this is a huge mistake for the Palestinian national movement to go down this rabbit hole, because Israel will not give 3 million Palestinians under occupation equal rights, including the right to vote in Israel, because they will essentially be doing away with the Jewish state as a result of that. So they're not going to achieve their objectives, and to give up on the pursuit of an independent Palestinian state at a time when the whole world has essentially recognized their right to an independent Palestinian state. And just to abandon that in favor of living in Israel with equal rights, it's a fantasy which would just do their cause great damage.
Shibli?
Yeah, first of all, on the second question, which is really interesting, I mean, I think there are obviously generational differences. For example, I think the young people in the Palestinian areas are completely dismayed with the leadership, and that's one reason why you see a growth of kind of lone actors and smaller groups emerging, and so there's really complete the disconnect, the delegitimation of the authority, particularly. And most Palestinians see the authority as a subcontractor for Israeli security, but they're dependent on it also because it has financial benefits, administrative benefits. They can't live without under the Israeli occupation. So there is that kind of a problem. Most young people don't believe two-state is possible. Whether or not they think one state is desirable is another story, but they don't think it's possible. These polls that have been doing for a long time. In the Jewish sector, interestingly, Israeli Jews have been moving to the right. So younger people, unlike in the US, where younger people are more progressive, younger people in Israel have moved to the far to the right. So on all those issues, on the issue of Palestinian expulsion, for example, in the Pew poll in Israel showed 48% of Jewish Israelis support expelling Palestinians from Israel. If you look at the young Israelis under 25, that's more than half of them. If you look at the numbers of people who want to annex the West Bank. More young people want to annex the West Bank than old people. Part of that is demographic change, meaning because the rise has been mostly in the ultra-Orthodox community with the expansion, and they tend to be more hardline. So that's really what's driving that. But yeah, it's interesting because like here in the U.S., I do polling, so I have a Center for Public Opinion polling. In fact, I have something to share with you later on Israel-Palestine, because I literally I got the results this morning. So I'm gonna share those with you. It'd be interesting. Typically young people are even young Republicans are more progressive than older Republicans. Young evangelicals are more progressive than older evangelicals. This is the data we have here. It's typical, right? Partly it's younger people, more idealistic or whatever. But in Israel, it's not. Among Israeli Jews, it's not that. It's different.
Let's do something in the back, in the yellow there. I'll get you a microphone real quick.
Hi, my name's Lisa. I was in Israel about a week ago with a group of people, and we went to the West Bank, and we went and met with 2 people from this group called Roots. Are you familiar with Roots?
Yeah.
So, does everybody know about Roots? So it's a group that formed. They even have a small building. I have pictures of it. And we had a guy, a Palestinian, who was probably in his 30s, young guy. And then we had a settler. He was an older gentleman. They both spoke, and we really heard, their whole story, and it's very compelling. And of course, we had a lot of questions. And at the end, we asked them what they felt about, 1 or 2 states. And this was what they said they've come up with. They meet for coffee. They, Palestinians and the settlers are friends. And what they said to us was they would like to envision a third state. Sort of, they tried to describe it like Canada. They said that there would be like all these groups that already live in their sections, and they could self-govern their areas, and they wouldn't be all then voting, because this is like a third state, to be able to, extinct Israel. And I'm probably not explaining it well, sorry, because I was there for 3 weeks and we had a lot of information. But I thought it was really a cool idea, and I was curious what you all thought about it, because you didn't mention that.
The idea of a binational or multinational state, a federation.
A federation or confederation or so on. I mean, I think all of these ideas are adjustments on the two-state solution. But the bottom line is, there has to be an end to the military occupation. And then you can work out political arrangements that take account, for instance, in this case, of the large number of settlements now in the West Bank, and they would, rather than be evacuated, they would stay there. I assume that's part of their plan. So yeah, all of that becomes possible, but the problem is, how do you get there from here? And I mean, sure, it's important that settlers are talking to Palestinians, but there's something else going on every day there, which is settlers and Palestinians are fighting. So I think it's important, these people-to-people relationships, but as long as the overall conflict isn't addressed by leaderships in terms of a process that actually resolves the conflict, it's very hard for these groups to get much traction beyond their personal relationships.
Let me see if we can get one more quick question in. Let me get you right there. Yep, we'll get a microphone real quick.
What you've both described is a tragic failure of leadership to take advantage of historical opportunities, and a hugely tragic manipulation, if you don't mind me using that, by foreign entities trying to insert themselves into the process, whether it's Iran, whether it's the U.S. Where is the leadership coming from that is going to be able to affect either of these, either a two-state solution or a one-state solution with the right values and equity. I don't see how any of this is possible. We can all talk amongst ourselves and agree on something, but between Netanyahu and Abu Mazen and anybody, is there anybody on the horizon in either Israel or in the Palestinian territories that can actually advance either solution?
Well, I could tell you how I look at it. I look at it in the same spirit of pessimism that you expressed. I certainly share that. I honestly do not think there's any transformative opportunity in any foreseeable future to transcend the ugliness of the reality on the ground. Now, but I want to say something about, when you say about opportunities in Israel, for example, I'll talk about the Palestinians in a minute. You know, you have, I mean, let's face it, Israel has drifted to the right and increasingly drifting to the right. And there are very few opportunities. Sure, the protesters have expressed a spirit of liberalism that is heartening and important and impactful, but it's been largely detached from the Palestinian question. In fact, to the contrary, to the extent that there could be a deal that would lead the right-wing Israeli government to back off in any shape or form, they're going to do it by rewarding the far right with more free hand in the Palestinian areas. That's going to make it a little bit harder. So there is no opportunity, as I see it. In Israel itself, liberals who have been awakened by these events recently have absolutely no opportunity if they focus only on the Jewish sector in Israel. The numbers simply aren't there. They cannot win a majority in Israel if they only rely on the Jewish sector, unless they open up to the 20% Arab citizens and figure out a coalition that would be mutually beneficial. There is no, and that's, I don't see it, but let's hope for it. But I want to find, just want to say, on the Palestinian side, forget the Palestinian Authority. It's a non-entity. It's a useful entity for the international community, for managing affairs right now, for the structure that exists. It cannot be transformative. I think there has to be a different kind of national movement and debate, and maybe younger people and more engagement. I don't see it, but that's what can happen. But I am an American. I'm sitting here. And my duty is to tell my government, which has had the biggest hand in enabling the one-state reality, to the steps that it can do. And one thing I want it to do is stop being an enabler of an unjust reality. Even if you cannot find a solution, I don't want to be connected to the entrenchment of deep inequality. Be honest. Tell people, tell Americans the way things exist. That's what I expect.
And Martin, we'll give you the last word.
Well, I agree that it looks fairly hopeless in terms of leadership. But if you look at the polls and the results of the last 5 elections in Israel, the right wing, notwithstanding what Shibli said about the shift to the right, has not been able to get a majority, except in this extreme form that they've just done. And the polling indicates that if an election were held today, they'd be thrown out. And a centre, left, right government would be formed. And that could well produce a different attitude under Benny Gantz or Yair Lapid to work with. So it's not impossible to imagine a future. Secondly, and I agree with what Shibli has said about the Palestinian side, Abu Mazen is going to have to pass on one way or another, and there's going to have to be a whole new political process for a leadership to emerge. So that is going to take time. But there is now an effort to bring Saudi Arabia into full normalization with Israel. And that is going to create an opportunity, a necessity, I would argue, to reintroduce the Palestinians issue into the normalization process. Because no matter what the Crown Prince whispers to Netanyahu or Biden, there is going to have to be a Palestinian dimension to that deal that Biden and the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia and Netanyahu are hoping to pull off in the next 6 months. And that way, it seems to me, using, in a way, if you think about it, carrot of full normalization, linked to significant, serious movement towards a two-state solution on the Palestinian front, is perhaps a way to generate more hope and more optimism when it comes to a two-state solution.
And with that, we thank our panelists, and thank you for coming.